Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It was a quiet Thursday evening when my neighbor, Mark, knocked on my door. The sun had just dipped below the trees, and that soft amber glow was fading from my kitchen window. I had just finished watering the small row of plants I keep on the sill: basil, mint, and a few fading daisies that refused to give up on life. Just like me, Mark stood there holding a casserole dish covered in foil and smiled the way people do when they're not entirely sure if they're interrupting something. I'd known him for about a year, polite, soft-spoken, always helping carry the mail up when it piled on the wrong porch. He's the kind of man who waves even when he's in a rush. He said, "I made too much dinner tonight. Would you like to join me?" For a moment, I hesitated. I've lived alone for several years now. Invitations like that aren't something I get often, and to be honest, the idea of stepping into someone else's home, even a kind neighbor's, made me feel oddly nervous. But there was something in his voice, a warmth that felt genuine, so I nodded. "Sure, let me just grab my sweater." His house is just 2 doors down from mine, but I'd never been inside. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I was surprised at how homey it felt. The faint smell of garlic and roasted chicken drifted through the air, mixed with the woody scent of something burning faintly in the fireplace. A single lamp lit the room, giving everything a golden softness. He led me to the dining table, small, round, made of dark oak. 2 plates were already set, with cloth napkins folded neatly beside them. I remember thinking it was a little too perfect, like something out of a movie. As we sat down, he poured a glass of wine for each of us. "I'm not much of a cook," he said, "but I like trying new recipes. Keeps me company." I smiled, nodding. "I know what you mean." At first, the conversation was light, about the weather, the neighborhood, the stray cat that always sneaks into his garden. But soon, as dinner went on, the tone shifted. It wasn't romantic or heavy, just honest. He started talking about his late wife. He lost her a few years ago, and though I didn't know the details, I could feel the grief in his voice. Not raw anymore, but present, like a faded photograph you still keep on the wall. I told him about my own life too, how my kids had grown up and moved away, how the house sometimes felt too big. I hadn't said those words aloud to anyone before. It surprised me how easily they came out. We both laughed at the small things, the way the neighborhood raccoons seem to know trash day better than we do, how the mailman always leaves packages on the wrong side of the fence. But in between the laughter, there were these quiet moments, pauses that weren't awkward, just full of something unspoken. Understanding, maybe. At one point, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a second, then steadied again. I remember the way the shadows danced across the walls, how they made everything look softer. Mark chuckled and said, "This house is old. It gets nervous when it rains." I found myself laughing with him, feeling the tension melt away. It's strange, I hadn't realized how much I missed the sound of my own laughter echoing in a room with someone else. When dinner ended, he insisted I take some leftovers home. I told him I couldn't possibly, but he wrapped them up anyway. "Just in case you get hungry later," he said. Before I left, he walked me to the door. The night air was cool, carrying that earthy scent of damp leaves. I turned to thank him again, and for a moment, we just stood there, neither of us quite ready to say goodnight. He said quietly, "It's nice to have company again." I don't know why, but those words stayed with me long after I walked home. I could still hear the faint creak of his door closing behind me as I stepped into my own house. It felt different, emptier somehow, or maybe just quieter. I set the container he gave me on the counter and sat by the window. The moonlight spilled across my living room floor, silver and soft. I thought about how small moments, like dinner with a neighbor, could remind you that you're still part of the world. Still seen. As I sipped the last of my wine, I realized that sometimes, connection doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes with a knock on the door and the smell of roasted chicken. I didn't know it then, but that evening would be the start of something unexpected, something that would quietly change the way I looked at the simple act of sharing a meal. And as I turned off the light and headed to bed, I caught myself smiling. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel quite so alone. The following week, Mark waved at me from his porch as I was trimming the little bushes by my mailbox. He called out, "I hope you liked the leftovers. I tried not to burn them this time." I laughed, remembering the perfectly good roasted chicken sitting in my fridge for 2 days before I finally finished it. There was something different in his voice that day. It wasn't the kind of tone that asks for company out of politeness. It was warm, a bit lighter, like he'd been looking forward to seeing me. I told him I did enjoy it, and he smiled that calm, steady smile that made it hard not to smile back. Later that afternoon, there was another knock at my door. Same rhythm as before, 2 quick taps, a pause, and a softer third one. When I opened it, there he was again, holding a small basket of apples. "Picked these up from the farmer's market this morning," he said. "They reminded me of you. You mentioned you like baking. It's funny how small gestures can do something to your heart before your mind even catches up. I hadn't baked in months. Maybe longer. But the thought of turning those apples into a pie suddenly felt like something worth doing. I invited him in this time. Just for a cup of coffee, I said. But an hour passed, then 2. We talked about everything from books to music to the places we'd once dreamed of visiting but never did. He told me he used to play the piano, and when I asked why he stopped, he said, after she passed, I couldn't bring myself to touch the keys. It felt like the house would echo too much. There was a softness in the way he said it. Not sorrow exactly, but acceptance, the kind that comes after years of carrying something heavy. That night, after he left, I stood by my own kitchen window and looked at his house. The lights were on, and I could see his silhouette moving about, slow, deliberate, unhurried. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he felt the same quiet sense of something new beginning. Over the next few days, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. I'd find myself taking my evening walk right when he was out tending his garden. He'd wave and hand me a sprig of rosemary or a small tomato, saying, "You can't let these go to waste." One evening, as I walked past, I heard the sound of music, faint piano notes floating through the open window. It stopped me in my tracks. He was playing again. I stood on the sidewalk, listening, not wanting to interrupt. The melody was soft, slow, and full of emotion, the kind of tune that makes you think of rainy days and warm kitchens. He noticed me standing there and smiled from the window. "I guess I finally dusted it off," he said. "It's beautiful," I replied. "Come in. I'll play something you might know." Inside, the piano sat near the corner of his living room. It was old but well kept, with a few small scratches that hinted at years of use. I sat nearby as he played an old tune I recognized but couldn't quite name. His fingers moved gently over the keys, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. No ticking clock, no passing cars, no distance between 2 people who had once been strangers. When he finished, there was silence. I didn't clap, and he didn't expect me to. We just sat there quietly, the way people do when words would only get in the way. He turned to me and said, "I didn't think I'd ever play again." Funny how company can change things. That night, as I walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, the world seemed gentler somehow. I could still hear the piano in my head, like it had followed me home. I thought about how we find connection in the most ordinary moments, through music, through food, through the simple act of being seen. For so long, I'd thought that part of my life was over. But Mark had this way of reminding me that it wasn't. That maybe it never truly ends, it just waits for us to notice it again. When I reached my porch, I turned back. His house was dark now, except for one small light by the window. And though I couldn't see him, I had the strange feeling that he was thinking of me too. I went to bed that night with a quiet smile. Not from excitement, not from anticipation, but from peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt connected. Not to the past, not to the memories that haunted the empty corners of my home, but to the simple, comforting present. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew that this wasn't just about dinner anymore. It was about rediscovering something I'd lost, the courage to let someone in again, even just through a door left slightly open. It had been almost 3 weeks since that first dinner, and by then, our evenings had become a kind of quiet ritual. Mark would stop by after sunset with some new dish he'd been experimenting with, or I'd bring over a pie, still warm from the oven. We never planned it. It just happened. The nights were getting cooler, and the trees had started turning gold along the street. I remember that one evening in particular, the wind had picked up, brushing leaves across the sidewalk in soft spirals. I'd been feeling a little off all day. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of restlessness that comes from too much silence. So when I heard that familiar knock, 2 taps, a pause, and one softer, I couldn't help but smile. He stood there wearing a dark sweater, holding a pot of stew that smelled like comfort itself. "Thought you might want some company tonight," he said, a little shyly. I let him in, and we sat by the fireplace. I'd started keeping the old thing lit again since he'd come around more often. The sound of the fire, that soft crackling and popping, filled the spaces where words didn't need to go. We ate slowly, talking about small things, his garden, the changing season, the books stacked on my coffee table. But somewhere between the laughter and the gentle quiet, the conversation turned deeper. He told me how hard it had been to adjust to the silence after his wife passed, how every little sound in the house used to remind him of her. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, even the way the floorboards sighed under his feet. He said, "It's strange. You think you'll get used to it, but you don't. You just learn to live beside it." I nodded. I understood more than I wanted to admit. When my children left home, the house had felt hollow, like it was too big for just me. I told him how I used to keep the TV on, not because I was watching it, but because I needed to hear another voice in the room. He smiled softly, like he knew exactly what I meant. "It's different when there's someone to share the quiet with," he said. After dinner, I made tea. We sat on the couch, both of us staring at the fire. Outside, the wind howled faintly, and the branches tapped against the windows. There was something soothing about the storm. It made the world feel smaller, safer. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said, "I didn't realize how lonely I was until I stopped being alone." That sentence stayed with me. There was truth in it, something gentle and heartbreaking all at once. I told him how he'd reminded me that it's okay to start over, even when you think you've had your share of beginnings. That sometimes, what feels like the end of one chapter isn't really the end, it's just the space where a new one quietly begins. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the fire, the flickering light reflecting in his eyes. "You make it sound simple," he said finally. "But it's not." "No," I said. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." For a long while, we just sat there, listening to the storm. And it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt steady. Like the kind of silence that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every gap with words. When the rain eased, I walked him to the door. The air outside was cold and smelled of wet earth. The streetlights glowed dimly through the mist, and the sound of dripping water echoed from the rooftops. He paused before stepping out. "I'm glad I knocked on your door that night," he said. "So am I replied quietly. He smiled, the kind of smile that feels like it holds a promise, even if neither of you says it out loud. Then he left, walking slowly through the puddles, his shadow stretching long under the streetlights. I watched him until he turned the corner. Then I stood there for a while, listening to the rain soften into silence. That night, as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind that makes you see ordinary moments differently. I thought about how fragile and beautiful connection really is, how it sneaks into your life when you least expect it, not with fanfare, but with the quiet rhythm of kindness. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something. We often think the heart heals in big, visible ways. But sometimes, it's as simple as a shared meal, a kind word, and the courage to let someone sit beside you when the rain begins to fall. Winter came quietly that year. The mornings grew slower, softer, as though the world itself was taking a long, deep breath. The trees stood bare, the air crisp enough to see your breath, and the neighborhood fell into that peaceful silence that only cold weather brings. Mark and I had fallen into a kind of rhythm by then, not planned, not promised, just natural. Sometimes he'd bring coffee in a thermos when the snow started to fall, and would stand by my window, watching the world turn white. Other days, I'd stop by his porch to bring soup or a loaf of bread, pretending it was just to return the favor, even though we both knew it wasn't about that anymore. One Saturday evening, just before Christmas, he invited me over to help decorate his tree. I almost said no, not because I didn't want to, but because I hadn't put up a tree in years. It felt strange to think about doing it again, like dusting off a part of myself I'd quietly packed away. But something about the way he asked, with that easy kindness of his, made it impossible to refuse. When I walked into his house, I noticed the soft hum of holiday music playing from an old radio in the corner. The fireplace was lit, casting a gentle glow over the room. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. The tree stood in the middle of the living room, tall and a little crooked, already wrapped with strings of lights waiting to be plugged in. He handed me a box of ornaments. Most of these were hers, he said quietly. I wasn't sure if I should use them again this year. I looked down at the small glass globes and hand-painted decorations, each one holding its own story. I think she'd like that you did, I said. He smiled, and we began hanging them one by one, in silence at first, then with small bits of conversation that slowly grew warmer. Every ornament had a memory, and he shared them with a kind of reverence that made me realize how deeply he still cared. I told him about the handmade ones my children used to make when they were little, and how I still kept them in a box somewhere, though I hadn't opened it in years. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the same ornament. We laughed, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was nothing romantic about it, just a quiet understanding. Two people standing close, both learning what it means to let life in again. When the last ornament was hung, he plugged in the lights. The whole room glowed in warm gold and soft colors. It wasn't perfect, some lights flickered, some ornaments leaned a little too far to one side, but it felt alive. Real. We sat on the couch, watching the lights dance against the window. Outside, snow had started to fall, thick and slow, the kind that makes the world feel hushed and far away. Mark looked over and said, "You know, I wasn't sure I'd ever do this again." I smiled, my hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa he'd made. Neither was I. We sat there for a long time, saying little, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the quiet hum of the radio. At one point, he reached over and turned down the lights, leaving only the tree and the fireplace to glow. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes not from silence, but from being exactly where you're supposed to be. When it grew late, I stood to leave. He walked me to the door, just like he always did. The snow was still falling, covering the ground in a soft white blanket. He said, "I'm glad we met when we did." "So am I said, my breath visible in the cold air. There was a small pause, not uncomfortable, but full. The kind that comes when two people understand something without needing to say it aloud. Then he smiled, that familiar, steady smile that had become such a part of my days. As I walked back home, my footprints the only marks in the fresh snow, I realized something had changed. Not just in him, not just in me, but in the space between us, that invisible thread that connects two lives when kindness is shared. I stepped inside my house, still warm from the fire I'd left earlier. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt like an old friend, gentle, comforting, no longer empty. I sat by my window with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the snow drift under the streetlights. Across the way, I could see the glow from Mark's tree through his window, a soft flicker in the winter night. I thought about how unexpected it all was, how something as simple as a dinner invitation could ripple outward, changing everything it touched. And in that still moment, I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, that no matter how late in life it comes, connection, real, human connection, is always worth saying yes to, because sometimes, healing doesn't arrive as a sudden burst of light. Sometimes, it's a neighbor's knock, a shared meal, a song played on an old piano, or a tree glowing quietly on a snowy night. And as I watched that light across the street, I realized that somewhere along the way, the ache of loneliness had turned into something softer, something that felt a lot like hope.